Welcome back to the weekend with Anthony Opperman. While we've certainly been focusing on the winter meetings in Dallas and been coming to you from Dallas, we weren't going to miss the opportunity to talk with our friends from the Department of Game and Inland Fisheries. And so certainly once again, welcome back in, friend Chris Dunnavant. And Chris, special edition this week, not only because we've been talking winter meetings from Dallas, but also because we've got a special guest with us this week.
Yes, great to be here, and I'm so excited to have our guest today, Bob Duncan, our executive director of the department. He's been the executive director for nearly 4 years, coming up in February, chief of wildlife for 18 years, and with the agency for 34. And I'm so excited to have Bob Duncan here. It's my privilege to introduce him.
Bob, welcome.
Well, thank you, and I'm delighted, Anthony, to be here with you and Chris this morning. So thank you very much.
Well, Bob, I guess first and foremost, I'm going to put you through maybe some of the similar things that I put Chris through on the very first show. Just give me a little bit of background about yourself and how you got to your current position with the DGIF.
Well, the short version is I'm a native of Southwest Virginia. I grew up in the little town of Radford, and I was blessed to have a family. My grandfather was a gunsmith and a boat builder, and I was introduced to hunting and fishing at a very early age, and it's just something that we naturally took to, and I lucked out later on, and when I got in college, I finally found out that I could there was a course of study to get involved with forestry and wildlife management, and I was fortunate enough to get to pursue that. And after doing what we call a little wildlife missionary work in the states of Kansas and Tennessee, they were good enough to let me come back home to Virginia, and I've been here for the last 34 years, as you've said. So I've been very blessed. Actually, most of my career has been spent working out of our headquarters here in Richmond. First 10, 11 years as assistant chief, and then 18 years as chief of wildlife, and then, as Chris said, the last several years as the executive director, which has been a great privilege to represent our employees. We've got a very dedicated and wonderful staff, and the sportsmen and women of Virginia really love the programs that our people are putting out there, just like the fishing programs that Chris offers.
And Chris, he spends a lot of time in the office, right?
Oh, yeah. He's on the road a lot, and representing our agency all around. But, he also gets out there and hunts some, too, on his time off. So really glad that he gets out there and does that.
I hope you don't mind. We're probably going to take a break from talking fishing this week and focus. I mean, if we got somebody like Bob with his expertise, we've got to talk hunting, right?
I agree. I gladly bow down to talking about hunting this week.
Well, Bob, let's get right into it. I mean, obviously, we're right in the thick of hunting season. I know one thing that's on everybody's mind is deer hunting. Just talk a little bit about the strategies, because I know even some folks here involved with Sports Radio 910, like Wes McElroy and his producer Andrew Williams, they've been out deer hunting as well. Unfortunately, both of them have come up dry in their first attempts, but maybe some advice for them in order to put themselves in better position to get that first one.
Absolutely, Anthony. Well, let me say the good old days are now. We have wonderful game populations, and I don't think when you go to the trophy shows, there's not a county or an area in the state that's not producing top quality animals. So I encourage folks to get out, whether they're after a trophy buck or if they're after a doe. The hunting is really good out there. Now, depending on the weather and what's going on and the seasons and that sort of thing, of course, everybody should have already checked out their equipment by now, and that's one of the first steps to ensuring success is making sure that you've got your stuff dialed in, doing some scouting. If you hadn't had a chance to scout, maybe take part of the day if you're out at a new location. Take part of the time to check out. Are they seeing scrapes in the area that they're hunting in? If they're looking for a buck, if they find a good line of hot scrapes, hunt close to those. And also a lot of fellows do a lot of different techniques. They'll take rattling antlers and try to rattle in a buck. If you're in an area that has a pretty high buck to doe ratio, that's pretty successful. And another technique that a lot of people use is they use a grunt call. We'll get to that a little bit later, but they'll use a grunt tube and try to grunt bucks in. These dominant bucks will come to the call of another buck. And I think that's one of the things that really fascinates me about wildlife is all the vocalization that occurs that we may not be tuned into. But fawn bleat calls, doe calls, there's all kinds of calls that can be used. And just being attuned to what's going on. I always find, just like I've heard Chris talk about in the past about the challenges of fishing during inclement weather, the same thing's true of hunting. I mean, there are days, one of the biggest bucks I saw the other year in Chesterfield, I was hunting with a muzzleloader, and it was absolutely a deluge of rainfall. And I had one of the biggest bucks I've ever seen. I'm sitting on the stand thinking, well, gee, I don't think they'll be moving in this kind of weather. And I happened to turn around, and a huge buck was staring up at the stand looking at me. Unfortunately, this buck knew where the stand was, and I couldn't move. My muzzleloader was in the wrong direction. The buck wheeled around and vanished. I didn't find out till later that day my gun wouldn't have discharged. It's the only time in my life that my gun actually got saturated and the powder load that I had would not have gone off. But it was a real experience. It told me you just always have got to be thinking positively and looking, because you never know when that trophy of a lifetime is going to show up in front of you. But making sure that you've checked your gear so that when you have that opportunity that you can connect. And of course, I guess one of the things that I always want to remind people, part of a successful outing is not necessarily whether you take something or not. If you're enjoying yourself, if there's a lot of things out there to be seen and to be heard, but being safe for themselves. If you're using a climbing stand or you're in a tree stand, by all means use a harness. And probably more importantly than anything else, in addition to that tree stand safety, which has become an area of real concern for us, that we have more tree stand accidents than we want to have, but also making absolutely sure of what your target is, and that you know what it is, and that you're shooting in a safe way, in a safe direction, and that sort of thing. There's nothing out there really worth risking anybody's life or injuring anyone. People can go. You never make a mistake if you don't shoot. And you can always think about the anticipation of another day in the woods and what the opportunities are.
And Bob Duncan, the Executive Director of the Department of Game and Inland Fisheries, joining Chris Duncan and myself here on the weekend with Anthony Opperman. And Bob, one of the things you brought up that I found fascinating too is the notion of being able to call in bucks and almost speak their language. And I know you've got some instruments here to help do that. Why don't you just go through some of those?
I do. This is a grunt tube, and I'm just going to do a basic, and a lot of deer hunters out there will know exactly what I'm talking about, because almost all of them I know have a grunt tube in their backpack. But there's a thing called a tending grunt, and it's just some short little series of grunts. And I can remember several years ago I was hunting near Williamsburg, and I don't have as good a hearing as I used to have, but I could hear a buck grunting in the woods behind me, and I thought, oh man, this is something. And it wasn't but just a little while later, this really nice 21-inch inside spread buck walked out, and I was able to get him with my muzzleloader. So this is the way a buck sounds when they're tending does. So that's a buck tending call, or when they're chasing after does. If you're sitting on a stand, a doe comes running by and looking back behind her, I'd say time to be looking to see what's coming on behind that doe. There's I don't use this, but there's just to give you some idea, there's a doe bleat call that the does will make when they're actually seeking out bucks, and they'll come to these scrape lines that these bucks make when they scrape back, and they'll leave their scent in that area, and does will come and check it, and then the bucks will get after the does if they're ready. But this is a doe call, a doe bleat of a receptive doe. So if you hear that doe making that sound, you hear a buck grunting. And then there's another call that's not generally used except maybe early in the season by bow hunters and muzzleloaders. This is called a fawn bleat call, and I'm making this on a fox call, not on a deer call, but it sounds like this. And that's a distress call, and does doesn't necessarily have to be their offspring, but does will come to that. I know bow hunters that use that successfully. The other thing is, it's a pretty good idea if you're interested in trying to take some coyotes, and we hope people will. So you can use these predator calls as a fawn call. Actually, I've had bears come to fawn calls. I've had wild hogs come to fawn calls, and I've had doe deer come to fawn calls, and sometimes some smaller bucks. Big bucks typically won't. But that's kind of interesting. And of course, the other thing that'll be going on as we speak is people are out for the second installment of our fall turkey season. And of course, I have turkey dogs, and the idea there is the dogs will course around and smell turkeys and then flush them. And there's one thing you can't teach the dog to do about turkey hunting, and that is they have to bark at them. And they bark at them, and they flush the turkeys. You build a blind, and you call them back. And turkeys want to be together. Now, The other day I was going to my deer stand. I saw 5 long-bearded gobblers. The gobblers tend to hang by themselves in these bachelor groups, just like bachelor bucks do at certain times of the year. But the idea is when you bust up a flock of hens and young of the year turkeys, you build a blind, and there's going to be 2 basic calls that you use in the fall as opposed to all the calls you use in the spring. And I'd like to share those with you. The first call is the call of the young of the year turkey. It's called a kiki run. And please understand that a kiki run, the turkey is just still finding its voice. So it doesn't really sound like a real finished product in terms of a turkey call, but it sounds like this. Now those young turkeys are looking for the hen, and the boss hen or the hen that's probably the one that is maybe the oldest or most senior in that flock will be calling and making a call that's kind of an assembly call. And it sounds like a yelp, but it's a longer yelp. She'll be making a sound like this. Now, if something excites her, if something spooks her or a coyote runs by or something, she may start cutting real excitedly, and it'll sound like this. And if she calms down, she may purr a little bit and cluck a little bit, and then she'll go back to calling again. But she's trying to call all those different gangs of turkeys back together again so they can reassemble and move on through the woods. And it's just great if you're sitting, a lot of times I was sitting on a tree stand with the muzzleloader and have 7 different gobblers walked under me. They weren't vocalizing, but just a little bit. But it's really neat, the calls that you get to hear when you're out there. And I was just going to mention, they're not things that we hunt, of course, but it's very rarely for me to set a deer stand in mid-December and not hear a couple of the owls that we have in Virginia. And they're just really cool. And a lot of times you'll be watching a barred owl on the edge of a field, and they'll fly off, and the next thing you know, you've got deer coming out. So a groundhog in a field can kind of be an early warning signal too. So kind of paying attention to all the wildlife that's out there can help you understand what's going on with the species that you may be looking for. Now, we have several very common owl species, but one of my favorite, it happens to be a call that we also use to locate turkeys in the spring, but the barred owl is a very common owl. And if I put it in kind of anthropomorphic terms, when the barred owl gives its call, it's saying, "Who cooks for you? Who cooks for you all?" And the northern barred owls don't do the "you all." It's just the southern owls that do that. And I'm going to give you, I'll do a mouth call of that. I have a regular owl call here, but the barred owl, if you're in your deer stand or in a turkey blind and you hear this, you'll know it's a barred owl. And so, who cooks for you? Who cooks for you all? If you hear a more plaintive call, the great horned owl, which is our largest owl and probably the most common in North America, the great horned owl has a very plaintive, and it's more people think of it as a hoot owl because its call is a lot softer. And what it's really saying, if you want to put it into human terms, is, "Are you awake? Me too." And it's hoo 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 hoo. The other night I was out programming tom-tom so I could make a trip up to D.C., and I heard a whole bunch of migrant geese coming in. And it's just amazing if people will stop and listen and watch what they can hear and see while they're out there. And again, using calls, using rattling and different techniques, it really just enhances it. I mean, it's one of the reasons I love spring gobbler season is you have that vocal back and forth between the critter that you're hunting, and to actually call it in or rattle it in is a very special treat.
And Bob Duncan, the Executive Director of the Department of Game and Inland Fisheries, and Chris, just as it always happens with us, this segment flies by. Kind of makes you jealous that you can't talk to fish like Bob can talk to the other wildlife.
You're right, and I think we should. I don't know. We didn't warn people at the station today, but there might be a whole bunch of animals coming in today. I think we should have warned the folks, but we'll see what happens.
Certainly want to thank Bob Duncan, the Executive Director of the Department of Game and Inland Fisheries. And Chris, before we retire for this Saturday, want to remind everybody that we are taking submissions, photo submissions for the trophy fish to win the Magellan Explorer 610 GPS device. You can log on to sportsradio910.com, look for our contest page, and you can upload your photos of your trophy catch there. We're accepting those submissions through December 14th. We'll announce the winner on our show on December the 17th. Again, Bob Duncan, the Executive Director for the Department of Game and Inland Fisheries, joining Chris Dunnavant and myself on the weekend. Well, stay tuned when we come back. I've got my game plan for the weekend as we wrap things up, our coverage of the winter meetings in Dallas.